Hi, I'm Christopher from Performance Bicycle. Now today you have decided that you are going to tackle one of the more difficult maintenance challenges in bicycle upkeep. That is cable replacing. So if you are a road bike user like I am here with my road bike, there's a lot of cables on your bike. They affect your performance, your braking, shifting, everything. So keeping your cables fresh and functioning at the top of their game periodically requires replacing the cable. Maybe the cable is frayed or damaged, or maybe it's just been on there for so long that it's all clogged up, or you've been riding in rainy, snowy conditions for a while or something. One way or the other, you've decided you're going to tackle this. Now, don't be afraid to bring this one by your local shop. This is a great thing to let your performance bicycle spin doctor and mechanic take care of for you. But that being said, you're past that point now. You're ready to tackle it yourself. I'm going to walk you through a couple of the pitfalls and hopefully keep you on the road to replacing your cables here. Now this is my bike, so I'm not going to be pulling the cables and housing out of here because it is such a job to get them all in and out. Instead, I've got some demonstration pieces here to work with. When I'm replacing the cables, the first half of the job is removing the old cables. So the first thing that I like to do is to cut the ends. The cables themselves will have little ends crimped over them in most cases. So I like to cut those ends off and release the cables from the derailleurs. Before you do this, you're going to want to take all of the tension off of the cables. And in fact, before you replace cables at any time, it's a good idea to remove all the tension from them. So to do that, on my bike here, I'm just going to pedal and shift down into the smallest gear in the back and the smallest gear in the front as well. And now when you feel the cable there, you're going to feel that there's just not very much tension on there at all. And now you're ready to remove the cables from your bike. So you're going to clip those little ends off, usually with a cable cutter. Just go ahead and snip the ends off. Use, in this case, a 5mm wrench, or to release the cable from the derailleurs. Do the same thing with the brake as well, if you're replacing your brake cables. Just clip the end off and detach the cable from the brake. And now you get to the hard part. So the next step is getting the cables out of the shifter itself. It's easy enough to pull them off of the bike. They're stuck in there pretty easily, but getting them to release from the shifters can be a challenge, and every shifter is different. I'm going to walk you through a couple basic types here, but if you don't see your type of shifter here, don't be afraid to pull up the instruction manual. They'll be online, or you can call our Spin Doctor Tech Support Services, and they'll help you find the manual for your particular shifter. I'm going to start with, this is a Shimano Ultegra 6600 10-speed shifter. So most 9 and 10-speed Shimano systems use the same basic guidelines for removing the cables. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to shift all the way down, make sure there's no tension on the cable. To get the shift cable out on this shifter, it's pretty straightforward. All I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the brake down, and the shift cable is going to pop right out of that hole right there. So I'm going to push the cable from the back until that little end finds its way out. And once you've got it started on its way out, you can just pull it straight out. Now, because I've already released it from the derailleur, there's no tension on the cable, so that's why I can pull the housing away a little bit from the shifter to find that little backing to push with. So then you just go ahead and pull the cable, and out it comes. And then you can, the housing will be completely detached once the cable's out. There's nothing holding the housing in place, so you can pull your housing out at that point as well. To remove the brake cable, the action is basically the same. You're going to pull that brake again, and as soon as you pull it back, you can probably see the end of the brake cable already in there. I'm going to try to move it here. There, it's come free, a little mushroom-shaped guy down in there. A lot of times this is going to butt into the shifter itself at this point. Sometimes it'll slide right out pretty easily for you. Most of the times that's not the case. So in that case, go ahead and grab yourself a pair of needle nose pliers and reach in there and try to just grab that mushroom shaped end and pull it right out. So now you're in trouble. Your cables are out. There's no turning back. You've got to get the new cables in. That's just one type of shifter. I'm going to show you very briefly two other types of shifters that you might need to get your cables out of. If you've got a fancy new bike, like I do, you've got new Shimano on here, and you'll notice that there is no cable protruding from the side. This is also true of Campagnolo and SRAM shifters as well. In this case, the brake cable releases in basically the same way. That you can, as soon as you open the end of the shifter, you can see the end of the brake cable right in there. To get that cable out, you're going to have to take this tiny little screw out, and the front plate will come off the shifter, and then the cable will slide right out. And the same with feeding it back in, it'll slide straight back into that same hole. Now, the shift cables on these shifters can be a little bit more of a challenge. The first thing you need to do is to roll your brake hood forward as far as you can. Once you've rolled it all the way forward, you're going to notice on the outer edge of both shifters, there's a little hole down here at the bottom, and believe it or not, that is where your cable is going to come out of. So again, the first thing you're going to do is shift it down until there's no more cable tension on there. And so then once you've got all the tension off of your cable, you're just going to push the cable, you're just going to back feed that cable a little bit, and hopefully it'll pop right out of that hole as long as your hood is out of the way. And then you can just pull the cable the rest of the way out. And feeding it back in is the same process, just in reverse. You want to pull your hood forward and feed that cable back up through that same hole. If you're not a road guy, generally speaking, you have things a little bit easier because your shifters and brakes are going to be in components. So you'll be dealing with just a shifter instead of an integrated brake shifter unit in most cases. For most mountain shifters, there's a screw on the inside of the shifter. It's just a little plastic screw that you're going to have to remove before you can get the cable out. Once that little screw comes out of there, then same idea, shift down so there's no tension on it, back feed the cable, and it'll pop right out of that hole. Don't lose that little screw. You're going to want to put it back in later. It won't actually harm the performance of the shifter if you don't put it in, but it just kind of keeps all the gunk out of the shifter. It keeps it working properly, so hopefully you don't have to replace cables too often. So now that you've got your cables out of your shifter, if you're replacing the cables, you might as well go for it and replace the housing as well. I'm just going to go ahead and release the cable from this shifter, and the housing on these shifters falls right away. For the brake housing, you need to unwrap the bars. I've unwrapped the handlebar on this side. A lot of times when you do this, the bar tape is going to become damaged, as it did when I was unwrapping these, and so it doesn't hurt if you're picking up cables and housing to go ahead and pick up an extra roll or two of tape as well. Plus fresh tape is just great, let's face it. To get this brake housing off of here, it's taped to the bar under the tape, so I'm just going to use a razor blade and cut that tape away. And with that housing free, once I release the brake cable from this side, I'm going to be able to just pull that brake housing right out of the back of the shifter, just like that. Now this bar is completely ready to be re-cabled and housed on this side. Hopefully you've been saving your housing as you've been pulling it off. It's usually when your housing is installed initially, unless it was very poorly assembled, it was cut to a specific length for your bike. Now when you're doing new housing and cables, your housing and cables will oftentimes come in a package like this, where you have sort of one big spool of housing in there. And the cables, you'll cut all the way at the end of the process, but the housing, you're going to need to cut it kind of as you go. So we'll crack open our brand new package of cables and housing here and show you how to go about that. So this is the Clark's brake cable package here, and cables are road and mountain specific, so make sure that when you're buying brake cables, you buy road brake cables if you're doing a road bike, which has these little mushroom-shaped ends on them, and make sure, and if you're doing a mountain cable replacement, it'll have sort of a little hockey puck on the end of there. Shifters are shifters, mountain or road, it doesn't matter either way. In this package, you've got everything that you need. You've got the cable, the housing, and also all of the little ends and fittings and fancy bits that we'll cover here in just a second. because you were smart and you saved all of the housing that came off of your old bike, you can use it to measure and cut the new housing. So for instance, if this was the piece of housing that you just pulled out of your road shifter and you want another piece that's exactly the same length, I'm just going to take my new housing, line it up, get it down there to that end, and clip it. I am not the world's best, most organized person, but this is one time that you're not going to want to get things mixed up, especially if your old housing looks decent on the outside. It can be easy to confuse them. Once you've cut and measured your new piece, I would just go ahead and discard that old piece. You're not going to need it anymore. With your new housing cut and matched to the length, the next step is going to be to go ahead and put some housing ends on. And this is another stage where if you're replacing your old housing, it's pretty easy just to follow the template that the old housing set. So in the case of the housing that I pulled off of here, really only one end of it had a little ferrule on it, which is this little cap. The other end, the end that goes into the Shimano shifters, doesn't usually need one. I'm just going to clean my cut up here a little bit on this cable and make sure it's nice and open. Sometimes when you're cutting a piece of cable, you might have to cut it once or twice just to make sure that you can really see down inside there, so it's pretty easy to feed the cable in. Once that's done, I'm just going to apply the ferrule to the outside. It doesn't have to sit on there very tight. Once the cables run through, the tension of the cable will hold the whole system together. But if you're worried about losing it, you can just take your cable cutters and crimp that ferrule a little bit, just a tiny bit though. You don't want to slow the movement of the cable at all, and that way it'll stay on there pretty snugly. Then you can go ahead and reinstall. A lot of times I'll like to start reinstalling by running the cable through and then feeding the housing over the cable. If you run the housing in first, sometimes it can be hard to kind of stab the end of that housing with the cable as it's feeding through the shifter and then around the bar. So I'm gonna pop my cables out here. A lot of times when you're buying a package of cables like this, one will be shorter than the other. I'm sure you can figure this out on your own, but the short one is the front, and then one is way, way, way longer, and that one is the rear cable, of course. So in this case, I'm working with the left shifter, so I'm going to do the front brake here in the United States. You're going to take your new cable, I'm going to feed it right back into that shifter. Right into that same, you got this little rotating piece in there, and feed that housing right in through there. And sometimes you'll have to poke around a little bit before it finds its way out. But generally speaking, the shifter is made so the cable will find its way out. So usually, you only have to poke around a couple times before you find it. Once your cable's through, I like to put a little tension on the cable and squeeze the brake just to make sure that everything's locked in place normally. If you squeeze the brake and nothing happens, you don't feel it pulling on the cable, then something's not quite lined up and you might need to push it back out and try your feed through again. In this case, it went in right the first time, thank goodness, because I'm on camera. So I'm going to take the housing that we've already cut and feed the cable into the housing. Get that housing lined right back up on the handlebar. And in this case, I would pull that old tape off of there and just grab some new electrical tape or whatever tape. It's going to be under your handlebars. Nobody's going to see it, so it doesn't have to be beautiful. It just has to hold the cable in place while you tape your bars. So yeah, go ahead and throw some tape on there and secure your bars, and then it's just a matter of reattaching and then readjusting your cable. If you're not matching up to old housing and you want to make sure that your housing is the right length on your bike, I just did the front brake, so it's not quite as big of a deal with the front brake, but with your rear brake and with both of your shifter housings, it's really important to make sure that you get the right length. You have a little bit of room for flexibility, but what you want to make sure you can do is you want to make sure that your handlebar will turn completely in both directions so that it doesn't hinder your steering as you're riding your bike. If your housing is cut too short, then you might find that if you have to make a sudden right turn that you're shifting at the same time. That's not ideal. So if you're measuring your own housing, usually I'll just run the housing from the brake or shifter down to that first stop, turn the handlebar all the way to one side to make sure there's plenty of length there, and then cut it off. And the same is true of the rear brake as well. That way you've got plenty of flexibility there as you need it. Every frame is different. This frame has easily accessible stops up here and externally run cables, but some of your more modern road frames or mountain frames will have internally run cables. That's that's a whole nother ball game. But basically, you just kind of want to follow the template of the cables that you're pulling out as you're feeding the new cables back in. Then once your new cables are run into the bike and you've got them reattached in your derailleurs or brakes, whichever it is you're replacing, then you're ready to retune, rewrap your handlebars, and hit the road with some crisp, newly adjusted shifting or some much more functional brakes. As always, this is a very complicated process, so if you have any questions, feel free to call your Spin Doctor Tech Support Services, or better yet, swing by your local performance bicycle shop and let them help you out.